look at what's on the other side of that boundary that you don't set. So I know you're feeling scared. I know that you're anxious. I know that there's all these questions that you don't know how it's going to turn out. But if you don't set that boundary, what is it going to look like in 6 months? How is that friendship going to be? How is that person going to be treating you? How are you going to be feeling? And then another year from that, and another 2 years. And usually when you kind of look at it in that sense, you're like, yeah, no, I'm willing to just rip off the Band-Aid now, than to keep going on like this and like allowing it to get worse.
Well, Breanne, it's so lovely to have you on the podcast. Thank you so much for your time today. For those listening who haven't seen or heard or found you on Instagram or anywhere else, please tell us a little bit about yourself and what is you do, and yeah, tell us where we can find out about you as well.
Yeah. So on Instagram, you can find me at diary of a people pleaser _. And I think that, that's pretty self-explanatory in terms of what I talk about and my experiences. So a little bit about me is just that after having 3 kids, I just found myself just riddled with anxiety, and I did not know what was going on. All I know is that I felt inauthentic in my life. I felt very fearful of judgment of other people. I felt like I didn't know how to use my voice. I didn't know how to speak my needs in my friendships and my relationships. And I just didn't want that for myself anymore. And so I started to figure out, more about anxiety. And I was reading a lot about perfectionism and people pleasing and how that makes us feel anxious. And it was the first time in my life in my 30s where I was like, oh, people pleaser. And like boundaries, what are even our boundaries? How am I in my 30s and I've never heard of this? So I just really dove in from there. I became super passionate about it. I started applying it to my own life. And now I'm a coach for people that are struggling with people pleasing and codependency and finding themselves in kind of narcissistic relationships as a pattern. And that's what I do.
Amazing. I'm sure there's loads of people listening that can relate to your story.
Yeah.
Just for those people listening that aren't 100% sure, what sort of thing, when you say people pleasing, how does that usually manifest in people's lives, and how was it manifesting in your life? How were you people pleasing?
Yeah. So what my clients usually struggle with and what I hear the most from other people is just there's really a fear on the other side of saying no or speaking your need if it might go against what you think might make somebody else happy. They often find times just even using their voice to say where they want to go for dinner or what movie they want, because to them that feels like so much pressure. Like if I choose a movie and it ends up being a terrible movie, then people are going to think that I wasted their time and their money. And it's like the pressure of that is so much that I'm like, I don't even want to choose a movie. Like you just choose, even though maybe I really want to go and see a certain movie. So we're often sacrificing our wants and needs because we are so fearful of making other people upset with us or, being judged by them or whatever it is. And so we often just end up overgiving and over sacrificing and doing things that we probably don't have time or mental energy to do just because we're afraid. So that's usually how it's coming forward. Oftentimes people don't realize that there is a fear on the other side. Sometimes with people pleasing, we kind of get stuck in these rose-colored glasses of being a very kind person, very nice person. I love to make other people happy. It makes me feel good about myself. I love to just be loving. And so those are all really amazing traits to have. And so we kind of get comfortable in that being our identity, not really realizing that it's actually rooted in fear.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess it's the intention behind it rather than, if you're doing something because you genuinely want to and it brings you joy in doing it, that's one thing. But then if the intention behind it, whether consciously or unconsciously, is rooted in fear of rejection, fear of abandonment, fear of failure, whatever it might be. It's funny because just listening to the word people pleaser, I always think of like someone that's scurrying around, like the girl in the office that's making everyone coffee, like that stereotypical idea of a people
I noticed
pleaser.
you looked at me as well when you said it as well.
Yeah, Giles would be that girl in the typical film. No, I mean, you've talked about you acknowledging that you're a people
Yeah,
pleaser.
yeah.
And I would say inherently, I don't think I am a people pleaser. But when you were describing it, I was listening and I was thinking like, oh, I actually do some of those things. And it's not coming
Yeah.
from a place of like, oh, I want, I want this person to be happy. It is a place of fear. Like saying no is a huge piece, right?
Yeah. And I mean, I think that a lot of us have many traits, where we might fall into certain patterns in certain relationships, or maybe there's some people that we feel more comfortable to, be honest with and be ourselves with, and other people we don't. So I would say that that is just a common part of relationships and navigating the world. But when it all the time in every relationship and it shows up in your friendships and at work and everywhere else, and it's kind of a common theme,
Mm.
that's when it's something to look at. And most of the time it's about how you're feeling. A lot of the times people who people please, they think that they feel really good because they think that they're doing so much goodness. But when they really start to look at it, they're like, okay, well, I find myself getting resentful a lot because I feel like I'm always doing stuff for everybody else and they're not doing it back in return, or
Mm.
they don't really seem that grateful for it or appreciative. They're really tired all the time. They're burnt out. They're stressed and frazzled because they're always having so much on their plates and really lacking self-care or putting themselves a priority and feeling anxious because when you're coming from a place where you're always needing validation from other people and worrying about what everybody's going to think and trying to please everybody and be like one step ahead of them to make sure that you've, paved the path of happiness in front of them, that is very anxiety inducing to live in that hypervigilance all the time. So when you really start to look at how am I feeling, that's when you can really start to see how people pleasing is showing up in your life.
Yeah, it was funny. I was just thinking there as when you were talking about as well, like I wonder if also we tend to people please to people that we don't necessarily want to please. I.e., sometimes we don't people please with our loved ones or our close friends. We tend to people please, like you say, with people at work or
Yeah.
people that we want to maybe gain some favor with, or well, I don't know. There's only two couple examples, but just thinking like often it isn't necessarily the ones that actually we should be people pleasing too.
Yeah, you know what? That's where I find it so important with my clients is to figure out the root of where your people pleasing is rooted. And that's going to give you some understanding of why it's showing up in different places. So, what I always say to people is that if you think of people pleasing like a tree, right? So, all the branches and the leaves and everything, that's what we can see. So, that's, not saying no, sacrificing ourselves, being inauthentic, feeling anxious, feeling resentful, all those things. But really, the people pleasing is actually underground. It's deep rooted from probably childhood conditioning for most people, or even a relationship that conditioned something in you. And that's what has created the needs that you're trying to meet through people pleasing. So, like you said, if you're people pleasing at work, maybe, for example, there was a lot of pressure on them as a child to perform. They really felt like they only got validated when they came home with perfect grades and they were the smartest child and whatever that is. So for them, their identity and getting acknowledged comes from being a performer. And so that type of person might find themselves people pleasing at work a lot because if they're not, taking on every project and working long hours and making everybody else happy and getting that acknowledgement, then who are they? And are they even successful? Are they even worthy? So we have to look at what it's rooted in and where it came from to understand why we're doing it.
And could that work the opposite way as well? Like if, for example, during childhood you kind of had to play small, or you also perhaps you had to be like the joker or the clown to like try and make, you're always trying to make people laugh, or are there other ways in which that can sort of play a part?
Yeah, I mean, I think that for most of us, a lot of the way that we are in adulthood is conditioned through our childhood, right? And through the attachments that we made with our caregivers. And so, you know, by nature, I think, especially children, they want to make the adult around them pleased and happy. That's just what they want to do by nature. And so when you do have a more overbearing parent that's maybe putting a lot of emphasis in certain areas, then that's going to really up that in a child and teach them, okay, when I do this, then I get this. And so that's how we start to develop these patterns. And so, people pleasers, they can come from a family where maybe their parents were people pleasers and that's what they watched. And that's how they got that conditioning is like, oh, well, mom never says no and she's always doing this and that. And so, or we're taught, you know, I I don't like to say, that more females are people pleasers than males because there's so many, but there is sort of a conditioning for females starting from childhood that, you have to be nice, you have to be polite, you don't want to make other people feel uncomfortable. And, that's a big topic of conversation that's happening now, when there's like the creepy uncle that wants to give the child a hug and the parents are like, go give him a hug. Like, you don't want to be rude. You don't want him to get angry. We're starting to question that and be like, no, like that's not okay. And your child should be able to say, no, I'm not uncomfortable. But that's sort of a new generational thing. I would say leading up to that, people often were made to feel uncomfortable and to soften or remove their boundaries to make other adults feel comfortable. And lastly, there's just children that grow up in homes that might have, an explosive parent or, there's a lot of yelling. And so they start to learn that if I do certain things or I act a certain way, or if I can, try to predict what's going to happen, then I can somehow control that person's emotions. And so that's what we start to carry into our relationships as an adult, that I somehow believe that I have control over the way that you're going to act. And if I work hard enough and do enough and be enough and say the right things, then everything will be fine.
Yeah, and you see a lot of that in sort of relationships, and we'll come back to romantic relationships. But when you were talking about females and how we're sort of like trained and conditioned to be quiet and just kind of like put up with whatever we're given, and I just wonder how much that plays out in the workplace environment when you see women rise to the top of companies or female bosses, what have you. If it's a man and they're playing the role of like the big boss, that's perfectly acceptable. But I feel like women kind of I don't know, there's a stereotype of women being like a bit of a bitch if they're in charge, or like, power hungry and like losing control. But I feel like I've read somewhere that women actually make better leaders because the parts of their brains that are associated with good leadership, like, inhibitions and stuff like that, are stronger. But I can't back
I
that
think
with any
that's
science.
absolutely true for sure. And I think that's something that we hear talked about way more now. And, even if you think about a little girl, right? Like we all know that strong girl that just, doesn't take any BS and she knows what she wants and she just is authentically herself. She kind of gets characterized as like bossy or, like we even label children like that as in a negative
Precocious is
light.
another. Precocious is often the word used, isn't it? She's
Yeah.
precocious.
Or
Yeah.
a brat, like
Yeah.
yeah.
And what ends up happening is that words like bitch and aggressive and all that kind of stuff does get used against women who are just setting healthy, normal boundaries. And they immediately retract because nobody wants to be labeled as that. So it's also learning to identify who you are and building your self-worth beyond what other people say. So that if somebody does want to call you aggressive or they do want to call you a bitch, that you're able to say like, yeah, okay, whatever. Like I know I'm not, and I know that what I'm doing here is just a normal, healthy boundary, and I'm great with that. So, it's finding that own self-worth in ourselves and that own confidence.
Yeah, totally.
Too.
And just to clarify as well, obviously we're not condoning actual aggressive, unreasonable behavior in the workplace.
No,
females can be horrible as much as men can be horrible as well. And I think again it goes back to intention. Like sometimes I think women can get a little bit out of control and become a bit aggressive, but again it comes back to that fear of losing control and that feeling of needing to like rise up against the machine kind of thing. And sometimes it can swing the other way and it becomes less about having healthy boundaries rooted in self-worth and more about like feeling out of control and like you need to be as aggressive as possible to gain control. It's important to be self-reflective of that, I think.
For sure. And I think that's something that I like to really break down as well is that boundaries are not like a really aggressive form of communication, or they're not a wall, right? And so it's not an excuse or a field to hide behind. Boundaries could be with the intention of, being kind and being respectful and trying to work on making the relationship feeling mutually respecting and also that everybody's feeling heard. And so it's really a bridge, right? And so I think that's important as well. It's not, you might find when people pleasers are starting to, use their voice a little bit more and get some confidence, like sometimes they do sort of swing like it's a pendulum, right? It's like you go from not saying anything and being walked all over, and now you kind of are rageful about it because you're just like,
Yeah.
that's my whole life, like letting people walk all over me. And now you think everybody's trying to walk all over you. And it kind of like, it's sort of a normal process when you're starting to heal on that journey to sort of go, just a little bit too far to the other side, but it's about just learning how to like find that balance and just be rooted in respect.
Yeah, so true. So we've spoken a little bit about how this kind of manifests in the workplace, and let's move on to relationships, both romantic and friendships. How do we find this sort of people pleasing behavior affects these relationships that we have? What's quite common to see?
Yeah, I think I mean I would love to get your perspective, just saying that you're a people pleaser, like how it shows up in your life. We can talk about that after if you're comfortable. I'd love to know.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
in friendships I feel that with people pleasers, oftentimes we can be runners. So it's like, you have a friend and, when difficult conversation comes up or they're doing things to you that you are feeling aren't respecting you, or, even if they're just late all the time and you're feeling like it's a bit rude, but you don't want to actually say it because that will create some sort of discomfort and some conflict. And so we just sort of start to resent that person and think of all the ways that they're doing us wrong. And then we sort of cut them off and then just go and find a new friend. Like it's easier to just cut somebody off completely and go make new friends than it is to just have a conversation and be authentic and honest and allow that person to actually be like, oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize that. Let me work on that. We just avoid discomfort at any cost. So it's hard to really develop deep, meaningful friendships because we're not really being ourselves. We're not letting them see who we are, what hurts us. We're not communicating with them. It's really dishonest. So I would say that that's how it shows up in friendships. And then in relationships, yeah, same thing. You find that you're just always putting yourself last. So that other person's needs really become prioritized and it's at the expense of your own. And so instead of a relationship being equal, you find like this person is having all their needs met, they feel heard, they get all the time and attention they need, and the other person's way down here, which again leads to feelings of resentment later.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, that sort of the resentment is kind of the key word there, and I think anyone who's listening now will know when they've been in a situation where they, like you say, where someone's annoyed you or pissed you off in some way, that you do, if you are someone who is a dedicated person to dedicated to that other person in lots of ways, you do lots for them, whatever it might be. You're always, like you say, always showing up on time. You're the one who's making the effort to contact them, that kind of stuff. And you don't feel that reciprocation, then you do start to sort of like, it goes almost immediately to, well, I'm just going to cut this person out, kind of cut this person out of my life a little bit, which is, and like you say, at the basis of it all is a lack of communication. It's a communication issue.
Yeah. And fear, right? Like,
Yeah.
what if I do say this and then they get really angry with me, or, maybe they even like an example for me that I found when I was going on my own journey was that I really wanted to be there for people no matter what, because I had this fear that if I wasn't available to them whenever they wanted me and needed me, that they would go and find somebody else to be that person. And I was so afraid of not being important in their life. So I didn't want to set a boundary and say, like, listen, I'm drowning in my own life right now and I just can't really talk about, what's going on today, maybe like tomorrow or something, because I thought if I am not here for them right in this very moment that they need me, then they'll go and talk to somebody else and then that will be their person now. And then who am I? Our relationships are based so much in our minds on what we can do for them and not because of who we are. So if I'm not doing for you and sacrificing for you and providing for you, then you're not going to need me.
And that is entirely my My people pleasing in a nutshell.
There you go.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah. When you
And
were
so
totally
it
like, yeah.
becomes, yeah. And so you have to start to be like, okay, you know what? These are the qualities about me that make me a great person, not because of all the things that I'm doing, but just because of who I am. And it's really just learning to self-talk and trust that, okay, if I set a boundary here and I'm not able to meet their need right now, that I'm still a great friend and they're still going to like me. You almost have to speak out loud against all the self talk that's coming through about all the negative things that are going to happen. And, you know, there's also something to be said for just laying out your cards and letting people walk away or knowing how they are in your relationship too. You know, we like sometimes hang on to these toxic friendships and you know we're not being authentic, we're not being honest, and so when we finally do that and it doesn't work out because they don't meet us with that same respect, you know, they come up with these toxic behaviors like, you know, the gaslighting and manipulation and victimizing and all that kind of stuff, then that's a really great opportunity for people to reflect on their relationships and be
Mm.
like, okay, this person might have stayed a friend of my life for 10 years, but now after a year and a half, I know exactly the type of person they are and how they're going to treat me. So let's just let them go so we can make room for the people that actually want to hear me and respect me and meet me in the middle.
Yeah, it's so true. And also, I suppose, you know, if you are doing, you know, trying to honor yourself and your own needs and stuff, I think people always, yeah, I think that people's intentions always shine through. And I think as humans, we can kind of intuitively work out why someone is acting the way they're acting, what the you know what the energy is
Yeah.
behind it. We see it in like romantic relationships, for example, if someone's like being really 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 needy or being really aloof and standoffish and stuff, we can instantly pick up on that energy and be like, oh man,
Mm-hmm.
this person's like way too intense, or like really like putting all of their happiness on me or whatever it is. And it's the same with friendships. I think like if you have got a people pleaser friend and you're not inherently a people pleaser, you can tell when they're doing it and you can tell why they're doing it. And you know, like it's not, they're not doing it because they like me or they think I'm special. They're doing it to fulfill something within themselves. And then it does
Yeah.
puts like a weird dynamic on the relationship and the friendship or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And it's like
Sometimes. Yeah.
it's tricky. And I do think, yeah, maybe taking a step back, it gives you time to like get rid of the toxic friends and get rid of the people that are just kind of using you, and actually strengthen the friends that you do have. And actually it makes you a better friend, I think, when you're not focusing on like how can I make people like me all the time, you know. It
Mm-hmm.
comes from a more
Yeah.
authentic place.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that one of the things that happens to a lot of people pleasers is that the relationships that they attract are those toxic people that are just
Mm.
trying to use them because, you know, who's a toxic person going to go after? Obviously, somebody that has no boundaries and that they can get whatever they need from them and push the limits. So, yeah, you're really opening the door to a lot of unhealthy relationships.
Well, that's so true. It kind of reminds me of like people's attachment styles, and like, you know, if you have a kind of anxious attachment style, you're more likely to attract an avoidant person, because
Yeah.
avoidant people know that they can kind of do what they want, and the anxious person will be like, it's okay, just walk all over me, and vice versa. So yeah,
Yeah,
it's so interesting how we do kind of attract the opposite of us.
it is. Just because I think that you know, it goes back to that conditioning too, right? So it's like, what were we trying to yearn for as a child too, right? So if somebody was, you know, maybe emotionally absent as a parent, then we're going to feel a bit more needy and like trying to almost earn it. And
Mm.
that's how it comes out in our relationships too, right? It's like, it doesn't just come freely. It's like, I am responsible and I have to do the work to try to get it. And sometimes it becomes such a deep conditioning that we almost go for the challenge, right? It's like you could have a really healthy, emotionally mature person, and then you could have this really unhealthy avoidant style. And it's like the people pleaser is naturally going to want to try to earn that one because getting it for free feels so uncomfortable and so foreign. And it's almost like I don't know what to do with it. You're just so nice and respectful and giving me everything I want. I don't really know even how to handle that, but I know how to try to get somebody's attention and like,
Mm.
you know, earn it and work for it and all that kind of stuff. So we are just naturally sort of drawn to that, which is super unhealthy.
Yeah. Well, let's
Yeah.
talk about boundaries and boundary setting. And obviously that for a lot of people is quite an uncomfortable thing to
Yeah.
instill in relationships. I mean, particularly, I think actually in some ways is harder maybe in friendships than it is in romantic relationships sometimes. Um, Tell us a bit about how, like, obviously you discovered that you needed to start doing that in your own
Yeah.
life, but
Yeah.
for people that are kind of at that point where they're like, I need to start setting some boundaries. What are the first kind of steps that you need to kind of take to put in some healthy boundaries for yourself?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So I always tell people, first of all, expect it to be extremely uncomfortable. Like, know that you're going to be crawling in your skin. You're going to feel anxious. You're going to want to run away from this. That is part of the process, and there's no way to go around it. So you just have to do it anyways, even though you're feeling all these feelings. And I also tell people that you're not going to go from a place of not having any boundaries to jumping into the most established relationship with the most conditioning and just lay down the changes that you want to see. Like that's just not going to happen. And so what we want to do is we just want to get comfortable with using our voice. And so that can look like I said earlier, it's picking the restaurant. Normally I just let everybody else do it. I feel really uncomfortable with it. So I don't. And, a way to practice is that I'm going to say, this is where I want to go for dinner. And it's just getting used to stepping into that discomfort of actually using our voice and saying something that we need. And then once you kind of get comfortable with that, here's an example of what I did. So I went to the hair salon and I really did not like the job. It was a new girl that I'd never had before, and she didn't do a great job. And normally I would never go back there, somewhere that I've gone for 20 years. I would literally run away from it and find somebody new and just like get them to fix it. And I thought, you know what? I'm going to just be honest with her in a really kind way and say, I came in and it just didn't, come out the way that I was hoping for. Would you mind fixing it? Which I have to tell you was probably one of the most uncomfortable ways that I've used my voice before. But I thought to myself, like, I have to start pushing myself.
Yeah.
And I wasn't doing it in a mean way, or I wasn't trying to make her feel bad. I was just trying to say, like, I came and I paid for something and I didn't get what I wanted. And so can we please figure out a way to fix this? And she was so grateful because she was like, you know what? I'm so grateful that you told me. I never would want anyone to walk away unsatisfied. And like, your happiness is really important to me as a client. So come in and fix it. And I was like, I mean, it's just not that bad. Not every circumstance is going to end like that. Some people are not as open to honesty, but we don't know until we try, right? And so for the most part, I would say when people start setting boundaries or using their voice, they're relieved after because they're like, it was not as bad as I thought it was going to be. Like, I made it into such a huge, scary ordeal. And the other person was just like, okay, no problem.
Yeah.
I mean, you're talking to two English people here. So even though I was saying like, I'm not a people pleaser, even that I was like, oh, you told her you didn't like the hair.
Right. People pleasing under the umbrella of manners, right?
Yeah. It's so true. So true.
But I can imagine that was sort of the thing that you would ruminate on for a long time, like that kind of conversation. Obviously, how am I going to approach this? How am I going to say it in a kind way? You would just like, I can imagine the sort of thing that would take up a lot of head space and energy for quite a while.
Yeah. And you know what? There have been times where, part of this journey and what was really important to me was if I am going to talk the talk, I have to be able to walk the walk. So I can't sit here as a life coach and ask people to do things in their life that I haven't done in mine. So I really spent years making the foundation and doing it first. And having to let go of some relationships and friendships and have difficult conversation. And there was even times where my hands were like literally shaking as I was writing a message because people don't necessarily understand sometimes how overwhelming it is to just use your voice and say how you feel for somebody that is not used to doing it or hasn't done it in their whole life. And so it can feel really scary and really overwhelming. But I think what I ask people to do is look at what's on the other side of that boundary that you don't set. So I know you're feeling scared. I know that you're anxious. I know that there's all these questions that you don't know how it's going to turn out. But if you don't set that boundary, what is it going to look like in 6 months? how is that friendship going to be? How is that person going to be treating you? How are you going to be feeling? And then another year from that, and another 2 years. And usually when you kind of look at it in that sense, you're like, yeah, no, I'm willing to just rip off the Band-Aid now, than to keep going on like this and like allowing it to get worse. So that's a good practice as well for when you're starting to set boundaries that are uncomfortable. You have to really look at the relationships that you have in your life and what you want them to look like and the kind of space that you want to take up in those relationships.
Yeah, I mean, confrontation is never nice for anyone, and it can be really painful in that moment. But I think the immediate pain of setting the boundary or having the difficult conversation or potentially something ending in an argument or a big confrontation, that immediate pain is never going to be as painful as like long-term boundary crossing and people constantly walking all over you or taking advantage or not showing up for you or being toxic in some way. That is far more destructive in like a more insidious way. And it might not be like, you're saying your hands were shaking as you're sending a text. Like the feeling of having your boundaries crossed might not be that intense, like freak out panic attack feeling, but it might just be a low-key feeling of uncomfortable, but it goes on for years and years and years and years, and that can be like way more destructive than that horrible panic attack inducing moment when you have to send the text of the difficult conversation.
For sure. And sometimes, on the other side of that boundary, that person didn't even realize how you were feeling. Sometimes we create stories in our head about what they're thinking and what they're feeling and how they're going to react. And then when we said it, they actually had no idea that they were even having that effect. And they feel really bad about that. So, it's a really good opportunity to, tweak the relationships in your life and hopefully make them better. And again, it's shine the light on the ones that are destructive or are there just to use you. So that's sort of how I would ease into it. And I always tell people practice. It's almost like, you're studying in school. I say, if there's a boundary that you want to set in a relationship and it's feeling really overwhelming to you, write it out, say it out loud, practice it, and then also be prepared for all the different kind of responses that you might get. So, prepare yourself for if that person comes back and they're really aggressive and angry about it, and prepare yourself for what happens if they try to guilt trip you and, turn it back around. Have all the different responses there and practice what you'll say on the other side of those so that when it inevitably happens, then at least you're prepared. Because one of the most challenging spots that people pleasers get themselves into is being unprepared. So somebody just comes at them unexpectedly with something and then they don't know what to do. And so they just fall back into that old conditioning, right? And so it's like really having that preparation before you go into a circumstance is going to give you so much more confidence to handle whatever comes your way from it.
Oh, totally. And I was just thinking, like you're saying, going back into your old habits, it feels like if you were at that point where you were about to like really follow through with something, falling back, you probably fall back further because you've got that there's more of an intensity there to like people please even more.
Well, even from the other person's perspective, particularly if it is like a toxic relationship, I think if you try and set that boundary and then they act aggressively and then you're kind of like, oh, never mind, sorry. They know that they can cross you. They know that there's nothing that you're going to ever do. All they need to do is act aggressively and they know that you'll just retreat again. So it kind of solidifies the disrespect in some ways, I think.
Oh. Yeah. And that's what I tell people is don't set a boundary that you're not willing to follow through on, because it's exactly that. If you say it and then you don't actually do it, that person has just learned, they're not going to do anything anyway. So I'll just continue, right? It's kind of like when the child throws a tantrum and then you end up giving them the thing they want. It's like, okay, I just learned if I throw myself on the floor and kick and scream, like I'm going to get what I want. So that's what I'll be doing next time.
Yeah, so true. It's kind of reminds me of in like relationships when people give their partner an ultimatum and then they don't follow through. It's like, oh, please do this, please change this, otherwise I'm going to break up with you. And then they don't change and they don't get broken up with, and it's just this perpetuating cycle.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that something to look at as well is the delivery of it, right? We're not asking people if they would mind to doing that or would it be okay if you stopped fat shaming me or whatever it is that's coming up for you? Because then you're putting it in their hands to decide if they really want to actually do that. And so you really have to be clear with what you're saying and letting them know that they can't do that anymore. And I heard a really great example. Like if you have a child that's coloring, for example, and you need to go to the bathroom, and you say like, okay, I'm going to go to the bathroom. Like, please don't color on the walls while I'm gone. And then you leave. You're really giving them the opportunity to decide if they want to do that or not. So that's a request. But a boundary is like, okay, I'm going to go to the bathroom now. I'm going to take these markers and I'm going to put them on top of the fridge. And then when I get back, I'll give them back to you. You're not leaving any room for them to decide if they really want to respect you or not. You are being the authority and you are setting the tone and saying what's going to happen. And, that's not mean. There's nothing mean about that. You're just protecting your walls.
It's so funny. I'm just laughing because it reminded me of when I was a kid and my mum was doing some ironing and I wasn't even close to the ironing board, but she came up to me and said, I'm going up to the toilet. Don't touch the iron. It's really hot. And as soon as she left the room, I must have been like 4 or something. I just went straight up to the iron and put my whole hand onto the iron.
Yeah.
She told me not to.
Yeah.
And obviously, but it's like, yeah, it kind of was hilarious in hindsight, but it's so true. So just like in terms of how to structure a boundary, set it, like putting a boundary in place, have you got any kind of like things that people can say, like scripts that you can use? Say if you're setting a boundary with a friend who's always late or something.
Yeah, I mean, I think it doesn't even need to be harsh or cold or anything like that. I think it does need to be authentic to who you are and how you feel comfortable speaking. And so I don't really like to give, scripts, but I think it's just important to remember why you're saying it. So let's say you have a friend that is always late. It's okay to say, so every time we get together, you're always 20 minutes late, and it makes me feel like you don't respect my time. So if we're going to meet, I need you to show up on time. Otherwise, I'm not going to have dinner with you anymore because I can't be sitting in a restaurant for half an hour when my kids are at home and I don't have that much time. Like it can be conversational, but you're setting the tone that I'm feeling disrespected. I need this to change. And if it doesn't, then there's going to be changes in our relationship or changes in what we do. You're not saying, would it be okay if you just tried harder next time to be on time? Like that's very wishy-washy and you're really not communicating how important it is to you either.
That's brilliant. That's really good advice. Let's talk a bit about the sort of more toxic, kind of verging on abusive, narcissistic relationships. Now, I will caveat this by saying that I hear a lot about narcissists and narcissism, and I do think the word gets thrown around a lot nowadays. And I think because it's now in the mainstream, everyone's very quick to diagnose like exes and friends with narcissistic personality disorder and stuff like that. And of course, it's important to say not everyone is a narcissist. And some people can, display the behaviors of narcissism, but it does not necessarily mean they are a narcissist. Can you just explain a little bit about what we mean by what is a narcissist? What's a narcissistic trait? How do these toxic relationships kind of manifest, and how does people pleasing perpetuate that cycle?
Yeah. First of all, I agree with you. I think that that's definitely a big topic right now, and one that people are finding problematic is that it is being overused and misused. On the flip side of that, though, one thing to consider is that, narcissism, it used to be like a diagnosable disorder. And so you'd have to go to a psychologist and you'd have to be diagnosed. And if we know narcissists, they're not people that are going to psychologists to get diagnosed on their personality, And so it's like people almost felt like they weren't able to identify narcissistic people or traits because they were not a psychologist. And it's like, well, I can't diagnose you with a disorder, so therefore I can't really acknowledge it or say anything. So I do love that it's trending in the direction of being more of a personality style. And so we are feeling more empowered to actually identify those people in our life or identify those traits or talking about it more. So that's one nice aspect to it. However, yes, it is being misused and overused. And I'm not sure if you guys follow Dr. Ramani, but she's an amazing psychologist who specializes in narcissism. And I think she had a really great analogy where she said, you know, if you think of like a soup, right? So there's narcissistic traits. So maybe somebody is selfish, maybe, you know, they're arrogant, maybe, you know, they've cheated on their spouse or whatever. There's different traits. And so if one person has that trait, that doesn't make them a narcissist. Just like one carrot doesn't make a soup. It's when you put in all the different traits and mix it together, then you have a narcissist. So I think what's happening is that people are like, oh, this person is really self-absorbed and they're really selfish and they're just taking up space in a relationship. They're a narcissist. And it's like, no, they're just selfish and self-absorbed and probably not somebody that you should be friends with. So maybe just move on. So I think it's really important to look at that there's multiple traits. And it's also how they show up in the relationship, right? So it's not just the traits, but it's in what they do to the people that they're in a relationship. And what's interesting about it is that no matter if you talk to a man, a woman, young or old, someone that they just met, someone that's been married for 30 years, it's all the same. And it's just so interesting to me that you can have somebody that lives on the other side of the world experiencing the exact same to a T traits and the way that they act. And, you know, there should be so many differences in terms of like personalities and cultures and ages and, you know, generations and all that kind of stuff. But a narcissist is a narcissist. And how they show up in the relationship is just to a T across the board. And so, you know, some of that is, yeah, they are selfish by nature. They need to be prioritized. They have a need for control and dominance. So really at the top of that hierarchy is control and dominance. And so everything else underneath it is what they'll do to get that. And so, you know, they might be grandiose. They might think that they're better than everybody. They might think that they should get special treatment. That's why a lot of people in narcissistic relationships feel like, okay, this person always gets what they want and they expect me to give them everything that they want. But then as soon as I ask them to meet my needs, they're enraged. Like, how dare I try to take up space in the relationship? And they lack empathy. So they might know how to use empathy as a tool. They know, you know, they're smart, right? So they're not like, you know, they know what to do and what to say to keep you where they want you to be. And so they know that empathy works. And they know that, okay, if I present this way, you're going to like lower your walls down and be like, okay, if this person does understand how I'm feeling, okay, let's try it again. I'll forgive you. And so they use it as a tool. They're not actually feeling empathetic because people who feel empathy for other people don't want to see them in pain. And when they realize that they're hurting another person, they'll do what they need to do to not make that person feel that way anymore. And so it's shown that narcissists don't actually feel empathy because they continue to just do the same things over and over and over again. And they don't actually care about how you feel. So that's why I think it can be so confusing for people, especially on the empathy part, because that person might be showing them empathy. And so they think, oh, they're not a narcissist because they see how upset I am. And the narcissists don't have empathy. And so I like to clarify that, you know, they can say that they do and act like they do, but that doesn't mean you have to look at what happens after. Did you want to jump in on anything? I feel like I could just talk for an hour straight.
Yeah, no, it's just really interesting. It's just making me think back to
thinking about all the people you've ever known.
The people that I've known. Are they a narcissist? Like, it's funny because I actually know someone that's been diagnosed with a personality disorder like this. And yeah, I won't talk too much on that because, you know, it's not really fair. But it's when you said, it's funny because every narcissist kind of does exhibit the same behaviors. Might kind of come up in different ways depending on, you know, life circumstances and gender and stuff like that. But like, it really, it once you know one, you can kind of spot one a mile off. It's really interesting. But until you've kind of fallen prey to a narcissist, you just wouldn't even come into your radar, because I think if you're not a narcissist and you are an empathetic person, then you wouldn't expect that of anyone else. You wouldn't expect someone to not be empathetic if you yourself are empathetic. I think that's the crux of it.
Yeah. And that's what makes it so confusing too. I think because a lot of people, up until now, anyways, didn't really know what a narcissist was until they had the unfortunate circumstances of meeting one or being in a relationship with one. But, you know, it's also the way that they act in the relationship too that almost becomes scripted. Like with a narcissistic relationship, you can almost write the script of how the conversation is going to play out just because they're so damn predictable with their behavior. So it's like if I come to you feeling hurt by something you did, you're going to get rageful and explosive and you're going to turn it back on me. And then you are going to be highly offended that I would be so hurtful towards you. And now it's like poor them that they have to be in a relationship with someone like you. And then they're also going to just, you know, use this now. They might hang on to it for like a week and give you the silent treatment and just really punish you, just like rub your nose in that thing that they did. And it's just like, it's crazy to me.
Yeah.
But it's all the same.
Yeah. And would we call that gaslighting? Because I know, again, that's another term that's kind of in the mainstream now. It gets thrown around a lot. Do you want to just give a definition of what gaslighting is?
Yeah, I mean, gaslighting is really where there's no ever acknowledgement of somebody else's part in it. And even if you're showing them proof, they will still never admit it. They will always try to find ways to turn it back on you and make you question, did that really happen? Am I being crazy? Did I do something wrong here? They'll really do anything to try to deflect it back onto you. So again, going back to Dr. Romani, just because she has so many really relatable examples, but you know, she says with a liar, you know, they eventually will cop to it. So if you know, go to them and you say like, I saw that you were at that party last night that you said that you weren't going to go to, and you show them picture, like eventually they're going to be like, oh, okay, busted. Like, yeah, I went. I just didn't want to upset you or whatever. They will cop to it. But a gaslighter will look at the picture and be like, whoa, like, look at you. You're so obsessed with me. Like, are you crazy? Like, now you're showing me pictures of you. I can't believe I have to deal with someone that's so crazy and obsessive. This is why nobody likes you and nobody wants to be around you, because you're nuts. And like they'll take the evidence and try to make it feel like you're the crazy one and do everything they can to deflect that you literally are showing them proof. And they will never actually admit to it.
Yeah, isn't it? I'm sorry. A classic thing is I'm sorry you feel that way. Not I'm sorry I made you feel that way.
I'm sorry that
yeah. I mean, and that would be like, you know, low gaslighting, right? I mean, that's just sort of almost like that passive aggressive gaslighting. But you know, true gaslighting is where people almost don't know reality anymore, because that person is always distorting it and always making you question your sanity and making you question what's real and what's not, and making you question if that you're even allowed to feel that way. You know, like a normal person would see that if someone lied to you and betrayed you and you came to them, you have justification for being upset. But a gaslighter will make you feel so confused in that situation that you almost start to wonder, like, maybe I read into it too much. Maybe you start to even doubt your own feelings to the place where you don't even know your identity anymore, and like who you are and how you feel and what's okay and what's not okay. And, you know, it's really something that it's psychological abuse that ends up they take it into their future relationships too. It's very long lasting as well. So super harmful.
That's why I use the terminology falling prey to a narcissist as well, because it is kind of like, the way I could describe it is like falling into a web, like a spider's web. And it's so hard to get out because like you say, you feel like you're the unreasonable one and like, oh my God, I need to do so much work on myself. Like, I didn't realize I was this crazy, or like whatever it is. And then when you do eventually get out, you're so emotionally battered and bruised, and you do take that forward into all of your future relationships or friendships or whatever it might be. It's so traumatizing. It really is. It's, you know, I have a lot of empathy for people that have been in sort of like, you know, really long-term relationships with narcissists, because it's it's just so abusive and terrible. And it is, like you say, it's great that we're sort of now talking about that a little bit more,
Yeah.
shining a light on it.
Yeah. And it's confusing because it's not bad all the time, you know? And I think that's why people end up staying in the relationship so long is because, well, first of all, there's obviously the love bombing in the beginning. So it's very magical. You feel like you found your soulmate, like you've been seen like you've never been seen before. And, you know, all of these wonderful memories. And what ends up happening is when the abuse starts happening is you kind of go back to that and like, you know, especially if you're a people pleaser or you're codependent, you want to try to earn and get that back. So it's like maybe if I just do more, or maybe if I say less, or maybe if I do this, then we can go back to how it was. But what people don't realize is how it was never real. That was all a form of manipulation to get you into the relationship. And there is no going back because that's not who that person was. And so once you kind of have that understanding, you can start to detach a little bit. And it's hard too because, yeah, it's not, there's still good times. And people can feel confused because they can still love that person, or there could still be things about them that they enjoy, or, you know, remember that time when we went on that trip and we had so much fun. And those are the things that people hang on to when the abuse gets really bad. And, you know, oftentimes people that find themselves in, I would say, cycles of attracting that type of personality is that they do struggle with codependency. And so they sort of make up excuses and justifications for that abuse, right? So you can look at someone and say, they had a really hard childhood and their parents, you know, were abusive to them, and like that's why they are the way they are. And so if I can just love them and communicate and work with them, then, you know, I can heal them and we can change. But that's not going to happen with a narcissist. You know, you can, two things can be true. You can love someone and also know that the way that they're treating you is abusive. And you can acknowledge someone's past trauma and see why they are the way they are without actually allowing them to treat you that way. You know, it can be both. And I think that's a really important differentiation between, you know, for people when they're trying to navigate the confusing emotions. Like allow yourself to feel two things at once.
Yeah, I saw a quote the other day. Actually, I can't recall who it was by, but someone said, you know, your trauma is not your fault, but it is your responsibility. You know, you can't. It's not an excuse to treat people badly. But yeah, I couldn't agree more in terms of like the confusion that can come from the aftermath of being friends with or being in a relationship with a narcissist, because yeah, it's like kind of trying to reconcile in your head the reality versus this fairy tale that you were kind of sold, you know. It's the love bombing in the beginning, like you say, where they paint this picture of being this perfect person, and they, you know, they might lavish you with gifts or say all this really romantic stuff, and then when that's taken away, it's like a constant fight to get that back. And that's the hardest thing, because you're like, but if I could have just changed this one thing about them, if I could just do this, if they could, you know, if we could just be happy or whatever it is, then we can
They
go
can't.
back
Well,
to
I guess it's an origin story for a people pleaser, basically. Like it's like a, you know, if people pleasing was a superpower, then that's your like kind of origin story.
yeah, they were with a narcissist.
Yeah.
Now they're Captain People.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, there's a quote that says, you know, they'll sell you a fairy tale, but deliver you a nightmare. And that's
Oh,
exactly what it is, right? Like it
honestly,
is just based off of
so
everything magical and
true.
wonderful and pretend, but what you get is nothing further from that, right? So
Yeah, so
I
true.
think it's just, yeah. And there's a cycle, right? It starts with the love bombing, and then they start to devalue you, and the abuse starts to pick up, and then sort of the discard happens, whether they actually discard you or not. So for some people in the relationship, it might be an actual discard. They might have been cheating on you, or they found someone else and they sort of just move on as if you were nothing. But for a lot of people, it's just the threat of the discard. Like, I'm not doing this anymore. Like, oh, I can't stand you. Like, I want a divorce, all this kind of stuff. And they act like you're disposable, but they never actually dispose of you, which one could argue might be worse. But and then there's like the hovering where they're like, you know what, I've been thinking about it and I want to try again, and I'm sorry and I miss you so much. And then you just And then it's like magical again. It's wonderful. It's like, oh, this person is like, they're back here, you know, like we just needed to have some space or whatever. And then it's
Oh,
around.
God,
Yeah.
it's terrifying.
Yeah.
It's terrifying. And yeah, like you
But
said,
when you know what to look for, though, it feels less terrifying, right? And it's not
yeah.
to go into the world and into relationships trying to find these things, because obviously nobody should go into a relationship trying to look for red flags. And, you know, that doesn't mean that somebody's not going to have a bad day, or you're not going to have an argument, or there are not going to be things that come up. We're talking like repetitive cycles and intentional abuse to try to control and dominate. That's what we want to be looking for. And so I think that when people at least have this information, then they're able to see it sooner than, you know, once you're already in and maybe having a family, and then things just get way more complicated.
And just finally, do you have any advice for someone if they're listening when they think like, oh God, I am friends with someone that seems quite narcissistic or has some of these traits, or in a relationship with someone? Do you have any advice on like how you can start to set those boundaries or even remove people from their lives?
Yeah. The thing with narcissists is that they don't respect boundaries. Boundaries don't exist. So it doesn't matter how you say them or how often, um, they don't care. So there is no way to implement boundaries into a narcissistic relationship. The best thing you can do, if possible, is to just go no contact with that person and to just cut them off. And, you know, narcissistic people, they're very driven by like arrogance and thinking that they're the best. And so they get really insulted if somebody doesn't want them. So it almost can make them try harder, whether it be a friend or in a relationship, like to how dare this person try to get rid of me? And so they're going to like try harder to come back in. And so that's why the no contact is the best, because it can get really confusing really quickly. And you can start to believe what they're saying and like you really get sucked back in. So it's important to just cut them off completely if possible. And unfortunately, it's just not possible for a lot of people. There's a lot of people who are in relationships with someone who's a narcissist, and men and women. I want to say that too. A lot of people on my Instagram who reach out in the most despair are men who are in relationships with a female narcissist. So, you know, sometimes we often think of as a narcissist and an abuser as a man. And so I just want to say, especially to any men that are listening, that you didn't know, and it can happen to anybody, and it doesn't make you less strong or less of a man because you're with somebody that is hurting you or controlling you or making you feel that way. Because a lot of men feel like I feel like I can't talk about it because it makes me look weak that I'm letting this woman do this to me. And so they don't say anything. And so I think it's really important to know that it doesn't matter, like when it comes to emotional and psychological abuse, it doesn't matter how big you are or how strong you are. It can happen to anybody. With that said, though, if you do have to be in a relationship with a narcissist or you're not able to fully go no contact, the most important thing to do is just, you've probably heard Grey Rock, is just try to be as uninteresting as possible, as unresponsive as possible, as unreactionary as possible. You know, a lot of times, especially with people pleasers, we, you know, if somebody hurts us, we want to like show them the documentation. Like, look, you hurt me. Like, can't you see here? And like try to get them to understand. Like, don't you understand what you did? Can you just say it at least so I can feel better? And narcissists won't do that. So you're just like constantly chasing them around. So it's like, stop doing that. Stop trying to get them to be accountable. Stop getting them to try to see how you feel. Stop getting to try to make you a priority or to feel equal in the relationship. You know, all these things that you're hoping for, you just kind of need to expect that they're not going to happen. And how can you just find a way to coexist in a way that you can for now, where you're just not giving them what they're looking for, which is attention and reaction. And so it's just like, oh, okay, cool. You know, they're trying to bait you and start an argument. It's like, all right, anyways, you know, just walk away and just be super uninteresting because they love a good fight.
Such great advice. Yeah. Thank you for that. And thank you for speaking for all the men out there as well who have abusive or emotionally abusive relationships or friendships, because it's so true. Like it's it happens and it's not really as spoken about, I feel.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And Breanne, thank you so much for your time today. It's been amazing to
Yeah,
talk to you.
it has.
And yeah, it's been really great, and you've learned so much. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.